Everyone thought radium was the future. Not just scientists, not just fringe inventors. Everyone. Doctors, industrialists, governments, ordinary people walking into pharmacies on ordinary afternoons. They thought radium was the key to eternal life. They put it in water and drank it before breakfast. They brushed their teeth with it. They rubbed it into their skin and told each other they felt younger. Radium was not the key to eternal life. Radium was the key to a very specific kind of dying, the kind where your skeleton becomes the thing that kills you, the kind where your bones dissolve from the inside while the rest of your body keeps functioning long enough to understand what is happening. But before anyone understood that, there was a factory in Orange, New Jersey. And inside that factory, there were rows of young women sitting at long wooden tables, painting tiny numbers on watch dials with brushes dipped in radium-laced paint. The paint glowed. The numbers glowed. After a few weeks of work, the women glowed too. They could see it on their hands when they walked home at night, on their dresses, on their lips. They were told this was harmless. They were told radium was good for them. Some of them believed it so completely that they painted their fingernails with the leftover paint. They dotted it on their teeth before they went dancing so their smiles would light up the room. They weren't selling medicine. They were selling the slow, luminous destruction of the human skeleton. And the people who sold it knew exactly what they were doing. This is Blackwell, and this is the investigation. The year was 1917. The United States had just entered the Great War, and the military needed watches that soldiers could read in the dark. Luminous dials, glow-in-the-dark numbers. A company called the United States Radium Corporation won the contract. The paint was a mixture of radium, zinc sulfide, glue and water. They called it Undark. The marketing materials promised it would glow forever. The company literature called it __, quote _0, __. The factory needed workers who could paint the tiny numerals with precision. The numbers on a watch face are small. The tolerance for error is essentially 0. They hired women, young women. Most of them were teenagers. Some were as young as 14. The job paid well by the standards of the time, roughly 3 times what a woman could earn in most other factory positions. The girls considered themselves lucky. The technique they were taught had a name. It was called lip pointing. The bristles on the fine-tipped camel hair brushes would splay out after a few strokes, making it impossible to paint the tiny numerals with any accuracy. The solution, according to the supervisors, was simple. Put the brush between your lips. Use your tongue to shape the bristles into a fine point. Then dip it back into the radium paint. Then paint the number. Then put the brush back in your mouth. Over and over and over. A skilled dial painter could finish about 250 dials per day. Each dial required roughly 12 strokes. Each stroke required lip pointing. That meant each woman was ingesting radium paint approximately 3,000 times per shift. Nobody told them this was a problem. Nobody told them it was dangerous. Nobody told them anything at all, because the women on the factory floor were not considered important enough to inform. But someone knew. In a different wing of the same building, the chemists who handled the raw radium worked under very different conditions. They wore lead-lined aprons. They handled the radium with ivory-tipped tongs. They worked behind screens. When radium dust accumulated on the floor, it was cleaned by workers in protective gear. The chemists were protected. The scientists were protected. The management was protected. The dial painters licked the brushes. This is the part where the investigation begins. Not with a headline, not with a lawsuit, with a dentist. His name was Theodore Bloom. He practiced in New York City. In 1924, a young woman named Hazel Vincent Cusa walked into his office with a complaint about her jaw. She had been a dial painter at the Orange factory. She had quit a few years earlier, but the pain in her mouth had been getting worse. Not better. Worse. What Blum found was unlike anything he had encountered in his career. The woman's jawbone was deteriorating. Not infected, deteriorating. The bone tissue was being destroyed from the inside. It was soft where it should have been hard. It was crumbling where it should have been solid. And there was something else. When Blum removed a piece of the damaged bone and held it against an unexposed photographic plate in a darkened room, the plate fogged. The bone was radioactive. Blum was a dentist, not a physicist. He did not fully understand what he was looking at, but he understood enough to know that this was not normal and that this woman had worked with radium. He began asking questions. He was not the only one asking. A woman named Molly Maggier had died the previous year, in 1923, at the age of 24. She had worked as a dial painter in Orange, New Jersey, starting in 1917. She was one of the first hires. By 1921, her teeth had begun to fall out. By 1922, her dentist noticed that her jawbone was deteriorating. He extracted tooth after tooth, but the bone underneath kept crumbling. Chunks of her jaw came away with the teeth. Her dentist, Joseph Neff, eventually removed her entire lower jaw. It came out in fragments. The wound did not heal. A massive abscess formed. Her mouth and throat filled with what doctors described as a foul-smelling discharge. She was in extraordinary pain for months. Molly Maggier died on September 12, 1923. The cause of death on her certificate was listed as syphilis. It was not syphilis. It was radium. But writing radium on a death certificate would have created a problem for the United States Radium Corporation, and the company physician who signed the certificate knew that. His name was Frederick Flynn. He worked for the company. He examined the girls regularly. He told them they were fine. He told them the pain in their jaws was from something else. Bad teeth, poor hygiene, infections. He told Molly Maggier's family that she had syphilis, a disease that, in 1923, carried a stigma so severe that her family would not challenge the diagnosis publicly. And they didn't. This was not ignorance. This was a strategy. The investigation reaches its first dead end here, because when you look at the official record from the early 1920s, everything appears to be in order. The company says radium is safe. The company physician says the girls are healthy. The death certificates say syphilis or anemia or some other respectable cause. If you are a journalist or a lawyer or a public health official looking at this from the outside, there is no trail. The evidence has been sealed behind diagnoses that nobody would dare to question in polite society. But the bodies kept accumulating. Between 1922 and 1925, at least a dozen former dial painters developed the same symptoms. Jaw deterioration, bone fractures from minor impacts, anemia so severe that some of them could not stand, tumors in their hips, their spines, their legs, and that strange persistent glow. A pathologist named Harrison Stanford Martland entered the investigation in 1925. Martland was the chief medical examiner of Essex County, New Jersey, which included the city of Orange. He was not a corporate physician. He did not work for the United States Radium Corporation. He worked for the county, and he was methodical in a way that the company had not anticipated. Martland obtained permission to examine the body of a former dial painter who had recently died. Her name was Sarah Karloff Mailefer. She had been 22 when she started painting dials. She died at 28. Martland conducted his examination with a series of instruments designed to measure radioactivity. He tested her bones. He tested her organs. He tested her blood. Every single tissue sample was radioactive. Not residually, not in trace amounts, actively and measurably radioactive, as if the woman had swallowed a permanent source of radiation that had embedded itself in her skeleton and was still emitting energy months after her death. Which is exactly what had happened. Radium, as Martland was about to demonstrate, is a chemical mimic of calcium. The human body cannot tell the difference. When radium enters the bloodstream, through ingestion, through inhalation, through absorption, the body treats it exactly the way it treats calcium. It sends it to the bones, it incorporates it into the skeletal structure. And once it is there, it does not leave. But unlike calcium, radium decays. It emits alpha particles, tiny, slow-moving, devastatingly powerful packets of energy, directly into the surrounding bone tissue. Each alpha particle travels only a few cells before stopping, but when it stops, it destroys everything it touched. Cell walls, DNA, bone matrix. The damage is precise, localized, and relentless. It happens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for as long as the radium remains in the body. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. It was going to be in those bones for a very long time. Martland published his findings. He coined the term radium jaw to describe the specific pattern of bone destruction he had observed. He laid out the mechanism clearly. The dial painters had ingested radium through lip pointing. The radium had migrated to their bones. Their bones were now irradiating them from the inside. They were, in the most literal sense possible, being killed by their own skeletons. The United States Radium Corporation responded to Martland's findings with a strategy that would be repeated by corporations for the next century in nearly identical form. They challenged the science. They questioned the methodology. They funded competing studies that reached different conclusions. They argued that the amounts of radium involved were too small to cause harm. They pointed to their own company physician, Frederick Flynn, who had examined the girls and found them to be in satisfactory health. They did not mention that Flynn had been instructed by the company to reach that conclusion. They did not mention that Flynn's own notes, which would not surface for decades, contained observations that directly contradicted his public statements. They did not mention any of this because they did not have to. In 1925, there was no legal mechanism to compel them. The girls were dying, the science was clear, and nothing was happening. This is the second place where the investigation stalls, and it stalls for a reason that has nothing to do with science and everything to do with law. The statute of limitations in New Jersey for personal injury claims was 2 years from the date of injury. The problem was defining date of injury. The company argued, and the courts initially agreed, that the injury occurred when the women were exposed to radium, which meant the clock had started running years ago. By the time most of the dial painters developed symptoms, their legal window had already closed. It was a perfect trap. Radium takes years to accumulate enough damage to produce symptoms. By the time a woman knew she was dying, it was too late to sue the company that had killed her. This was not an accident of law. The company's legal team understood the statute of limitations perfectly. Their strategy was explicitly to delay. Every deposition postponed, every hearing rescheduled, every motion filed, all of it served one purpose: to run out the clock. Not on the case, on the women. A woman named Grace Fryer changed that. Grace Fryer had started painting dials at the age of 18 in 1917. By 1925, her spine was deteriorating. Her feet ached so severely that she sometimes could not walk. Her dentist had already extracted most of her teeth. She was 26 years old, and she was falling apart. Grace Fryer decided to sue the United States Radium Corporation. It took her 2 years to find a lawyer willing to take the case. 2 full years. Attorney after attorney turned her down. The corporation was powerful, well-funded, and politically connected. Nobody wanted the fight. In 1927, She found Raymond Berry. He was young. He had limited experience. He had no particular expertise in occupational health or radiation science, but he agreed to take the case. Grace Fryer did not sue alone. 4 other former dial painters joined her. Their names were Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Albina Larice, and Quinta MacDonald. The press called them the Radium Girls. They ranged in age from their mid-20s to their early 30s. All 5 were visibly ill. Some of them had to be carried into the courtroom. The case was filed in 1927. The corporation's legal team immediately began to delay. Depositions were postponed. Hearings were rescheduled. Medical experts were challenged, one after another. The strategy was transparent and effective. Every month of delay was a month closer to the plaintiffs dying before the case could reach trial. Catherine Schaub's testimony, when she was finally permitted to give it, was the kind of testimony that does not leave a courtroom quietly. She described the factory floor, the rows of women, the brushes, the lip-pointing technique. She described how the supervisors taught them to do it. She described how the paint tasted, slightly sweet, slightly metallic. She described how the women would paint their nails and their lips with the glowing paint for fun, and how nobody told them not to. She described her teeth falling out. She described the pain in her jaw that grew worse every month. She described the doctor who told her she was fine. She described the day she learned what was actually killing her. And then she described something else. She described visiting the chemists section of the factory. The lead aprons, the tongs, the screens, the protective equipment that the scientists used as a matter of course every single day, while the women on the factory floor were given nothing. The company knew. That was the core of Catherine Schaub's testimony, and it was the core of the entire case. The company had access to the same scientific literature that Martland had used to identify the mechanism of radium poisoning. The company's own researchers had measured radiation levels in the factory. The company had equipped its chemists with protection. The company had done all of this while simultaneously telling the dial painters that radium was safe and instructing them to put their brushes in their mouths. The protection gap was not an oversight, it was a calculation. Scientists were expensive to replace, dial painters were not. Now the investigation has to widen, because the dial painting factory in Orange, New Jersey, was not the only place where radium was being sold as something miraculous. While the Radium Girls were painting watch dials and swallowing poison, an entire consumer economy had sprung up around the element. Radium water was the most popular product. Dozens of companies sold it. Some of them dissolved actual radium in spring water and bottled it. Others built ceramic crocks lined with radium ore and told consumers to fill them with tap water and let them sit overnight. By morning, the water would be energized. The marketing language was consistent across all of them. Vitality, rejuvenation, energy, youth. The most prominent brand was called Radithor. It was manufactured by a man named William Bailey, who called himself a doctor, but whose medical credentials were fabricated. Radithor was simple, distilled water containing measured doses of radium-226 and radium-228. Bailey sold it as a cure for everything: fatigue, impotence, mental illness, arthritis. Over 400,000 bottles were sold between 1925 and 1931. The most famous consumer was a man named Eben McBurney Byers. He was a Pittsburgh socialite, amateur golfer, and chairman of a steel company. In 1927, Byers injured his arm in a fall, and a doctor suggested he try Radithor for the pain. Byers liked the results, or believed he did, and began drinking it daily. Not occasionally, daily. Over the next several years, he consumed approximately 1,400 bottles of Radithor. By 1931, Byers was in severe decline. His bones were disintegrating. His skull had developed holes. Entire sections of his jaw had been removed. The bone tissue that remained was so fragile that it crumbled under the slightest pressure. A Federal Trade Commission attorney named Robert Wynne visited Byers in his home shortly before his death. Wynne later described what he saw. Byers' entire upper jaw and most of his lower jaw had been removed. Holes had formed in his skull. He was emaciated. He could barely speak. The man who had been one of the most socially prominent figures in Pittsburgh was dissolving, piece by piece, in his own bedroom. Eben Byers died on April 1, 1932, at the age of 51. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline that became one of the most quoted in the history of American journalism. It read, __quote, _5, __. When investigators exhumed Byers' body in 1965, 33 years after his death, the remains were still radioactive. Measurably, actively radioactive, more than 3 decades later. The radium had not gone anywhere. It was exactly where the body had deposited it, in the bones, in the teeth, in every calcified structure, and it was still decaying, still emitting alpha particles into tissue that no longer existed. But the Byers case, as dramatic as it was, is not where this investigation ends, because there was another layer to the radium economy that most histories skip entirely. Radium was not just in watches and water, it was in toothpaste. A German brand called Doramad marketed radium toothpaste through the 1930s and 40s, promising whiter teeth and healthier gums. It was in cosmetics. A French company called Radia sold radium face cream and radium lipstick, with marketing materials featuring a woman's glowing face. It was in chocolate. A German manufacturer produced radium-infused chocolate bars sold as health supplements. It was in suppositories, marketed to men as a cure for sexual dysfunction. Radium suppositories delivered the element directly into the body's soft tissues. None of these products were underground. None of them were sold in back alleys or marketed to desperate people in secret. They were mainstream consumer goods, sold in pharmacies and department stores, advertised in newspapers and magazines, recommended by physicians. The scale of it is difficult to absorb because it contradicts everything we believe about the relationship between knowledge and action. The science of radiation damage was not new by the 1920s. Marie Curie herself, the woman who had discovered radium in 1898, was already suffering from the effects of radiation exposure. Her notebooks from that period are still so contaminated that they are kept in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and anyone who wants to read them must sign a liability waiver. The danger was known. It was published. It was available to anyone who wanted to find it. The people who manufactured radium products had access to the same information. They chose to sell the products anyway because the products were profitable and the consequences were slow. This brings the investigation back to the courtroom in New Jersey, where 5 dying women were trying to hold a corporation accountable before the corporation's lawyers could delay the case long enough for the plaintiffs to die. The case of life. For most of them, that was not very long. Quinta MacDonald died in 1929. Albina Larice died in 1946 after years of bone surgeries. Edna Hussman died in 1939. Catherine Schaub died in 1933. She was 29 years old. Grace Fryer, the woman who had spent 2 years finding a lawyer, who had organized the lawsuit, who had held the group together through every delay and every setback, died in 1933. She was 34. But the case did something that outlived all of them. It established, for the first time in American legal history, that a worker could sue an employer for occupational disease. Before the Radium Girls, the legal framework simply did not exist. If your job killed you slowly, through chemicals, through dust, through radiation, you had no recourse. The employer was not liable. The damage was your problem. The Radium Girls settlement did not just compensate 5 women. It created a legal precedent that became the foundation of occupational safety law in the United States. Every workplace safety regulation that followed, every standard for chemical exposure, every requirement for protective equipment, every right to be informed about the materials you handle on the job, traces its lineage back to 5 women who were too sick to stand, and a lawyer nobody else would hire. The United States Radium Corporation continued to operate after the settlement. It changed its name several times. It continued to process radium. The factory in Orange, New Jersey, became a contamination site. The soil around the building was radioactive. The groundwater was radioactive. Houses built near the factory showed elevated radiation readings decades later. In 1983, 55 years after the settlement, the Environmental Protection Agency designated the former factory site and surrounding area as a Superfund site. The cleanup took years and cost millions of dollars. Workers in hazmat suits removed contaminated soil from residential neighborhoods where families had been living for decades without knowing what was underneath their homes. The company that had told the dial painters radium was safe had left a trail of contamination so severe that it required a federal environmental intervention more than half a century later. And there is one more detail that the investigation cannot leave without mentioning, because it connects the beginning to the end in a way that no summary can. The watches are still out there. Millions of radium-painted dials were produced between 1917 and the early 1960s. Many of those watches, clocks, and military instruments are now in the hands of antique collectors, in display cases, in drawers, in attic boxes. The radium in those dials has not decayed to safety. It will not decay to safety for centuries. Some of those dials are still faintly glowing. All of them are still emitting radiation. There are websites where collectors buy and sell vintage radium dial watches. There are forums where enthusiasts discuss the best way to display them. Most of those collectors have never heard the name Grace Fryer or Catherine Schaub or Molly Maggia. Most of them do not know about the factory in Orange, New Jersey. Most of them do not know about the brushes. The investigation finds a pattern here, and it is not a pattern unique to radium. A substance is discovered. It is monetized before it is understood. When the damage becomes apparent, the people who profited from it deny the connection. When the denial collapses, they delay accountability. When accountability finally arrives, they pay a fraction of the damage they caused and continue operating under a different name. The substance changes, the pattern does not. Asbestos, lead paint, tobacco, PFAS. The list is not a list of substances, it is a list of iterations. Each one follows the same sequence. Each one produces the same defenses. Each one ends with the same discovery that the people who sold it knew, and they sold it anyway. The Radium Girls were not the first casualties of this pattern. They were the first to fight back. Grace Fryer could not walk without assistance by the time her lawsuit was filed. She had lost most of her teeth. Her spine was collapsing. She knew she was going to die, and she knew that no amount of money would change that. She sued anyway. Not for the money, for the record. She wanted it written down. She wanted it in a court file, in a legal document, in a place where it could not be edited or retracted or reclassified as syphilis. She wanted the truth to survive her. It did. The women who painted those dials did not know they were building the foundation of every workplace safety law that would follow. They did not know that their dying testimony would be cited in courtrooms for the next 100 years. They did not know any of this because they were 23 and 25 and 27 years old, and they were trying not to die. What they knew was simpler. They knew the paint tasted sweet. They knew their teeth were falling out. They knew the scientists wore lead aprons, and they knew that somebody had decided their lives were worth less than a watch that glowed in the dark. The factory in Orange is gone now. The building was demolished. The soil was excavated. The contamination was removed, or as much of it as could be removed. There is a historical marker. There are plaques. There is a Wikipedia page, and there are documentaries, and there are books. But the watches are still out there. In antique shops in London, in flea markets in Ohio, in display cases in museums, in boxes in attics where nobody has looked for years. They sit in the dark and they glow, faintly, steadily, with a light that will outlast everyone alive today. Some of them still keep perfect time. The girls who painted them are all gone. The company that hired them changed its name and vanished. The lawyers who delayed the case until the plaintiffs died collected their fees and moved on. The doctor who wrote syphilis on Molly Maggia's death certificate retired and was never charged with anything. But the watches remember. Radium does not forget. It does not forgive. It does not stop. It sits in bone, and it sits in paint, and it emits its tiny, invisible, relentless particles, and it waits. It waited in the bones of Grace Fryer for 16 years after she stopped painting dials. It waited in the bones of Eben Byers for 33 years after his death. It is waiting now, in a watch on a shelf somewhere, for someone to pick it up and hold it close. They were promised a miracle. They got one, just not the kind anyone advertises. The miracle was not radium. Radium did exactly what radium does. It decayed. It emitted. It destroyed. Radium never lied about what it was. Radium is an element. It does not have a marketing department. The miracle was the system that surrounded it. The miracle was a world where a company could hand a teenage girl a brush dipped in poison, tell her to put it in her mouth, and then, when her jaw fell apart, write __, quote _7__ on the paperwork and walk away. The miracle was that this system functioned smoothly, efficiently, and profitably for over a decade before anyone with the authority to stop it bothered to try. And the second miracle, the one that matters, was that 5 women who could barely stand decided that the system was wrong and that they were going to break it. They did not break it with science. Harrison Martland provided the science. They did not break it with journalism. The newspapers covered the story, but coverage alone changes nothing. They broke it with the only tool the system had not anticipated: a lawsuit filed by people who had nothing left to lose. Grace Fryer did not need to win her case. She needed her case to exist. She needed the depositions on the record. She needed Catherine Schaub's testimony transcribed and filed. She needed the company's internal memos entered into evidence. She needed all of it in a place where it could not be retracted, reclassified, or quietly disappeared. She was building a bomb, and the bomb was made of paper. Legal paper, testimony, evidence, dates and names and dosages and lies, all of it notarized, all of it filed, all of it permanent. That bomb went off slowly. It took years, it took decades, but it went off. The Radium Girls case did not just change one law. It restructured the relationship between workers and the companies that employ them. Before their lawsuit, if your employer poisoned you gradually, through chemicals, through dust, through radiation, you had no legal standing. The damage was considered a risk of employment. Your body was a cost of doing business. After their lawsuit, it wasn't. Every OCA regulation, every material safety data sheet, every employer who has ever been required to tell you what you are handling and what it can do to you. Every time a worker has filed a claim for occupational illness. All of it, every single piece of it, runs through a legal precedent set by 5 women in New Jersey who were dying too fast for the courts to keep up. That was the miracle. Not radium, not the glow, not the promise of eternal youth. The miracle was that Grace Fryer spent 2 years looking for a lawyer while her spine was collapsing, and she did not stop looking. In the last episode, we traced how industries learn to treat workers as expendable inputs, how the math gets done, how the silence gets organized, how the paperwork gets filed. The Radium Girls were not an exception to that pattern. They were the purest expression of it. The gap between the lead aprons and the bare hands was not an accident. It was a spreadsheet. But this story does something that the previous one did not. It shows what happens when the expendable inputs refuse to be quiet. Next time on Blackwell, 5 people saw what was coming. They had the data, they had the evidence, they went public, and every single one of them was destroyed for it. Not by the problem they were warning about, by the institutions that did not want the warning heard. They knew it was toxic, they said it out loud, and the system made them pay. That is the next investigation.